All right, hello and welcome. This is our final exam overview, and I'm going to have, of course, two things just like we did for the midterm. First, I'm going to show the navigation just so you can find it, and then second, I'm going to go through and we can take a look at what the exam itself entails and give you some advice on how to structure your answer towards it. Right. Um, This is the home page when you first log in. I'm sure you're familiar with that. So I'm going to scroll down, or actually it's already showing there. I'm going to click on our lessons link, and then I will scroll down to the very bottom, and that folder there is for our final exam. Right? And you will see that we have the exam, and above that we have the exam review guide. That's going to open up in a pop-up, so I'm going to switch over to that, but basically that is all you have to do to navigate towards this. My suggestion is that you take that exam review and you just simply download it and save it, and then you can refer to it. You don't have to go back and try to find it again. That way, if you forget these steps, and you don't have to go back and look at this video just to navigate and get to it. All right. That's going to actually pop up as a Word document. So if you've got something that can translate Word, you should be good to go on it. If you don't, let me know. I can put it into a PDF and send it to you that way if you need that. And in the meantime, I'm going to switch over and we will take a look at that right here in this document. I'm actually going to do this a slightly different way than we have been doing. I'm going to try to actually upload it like I do the PowerPoints that I use in my other classes. And this takes just a second. So if you would just, actually it won't take a Word document. So I will have to just switch to the other program, all right, which does take a little longer too, so unfortunately. Okay, there you go. You can see that. I'm going to make that a little larger for you also. Oops, wrong way. There we go. All right. And now we'll go into the exam itself. That first part there is basically going to give you your instructions for how to do this. All right. What you're going to have is much like the midterm, it's going to be an essay exam. This one is going to be different though. Instead of just giving you a question, this one is going to actually check your understanding a little bit more. So what I've created is a completely made up, a fictional story. In that story, there are going to be a lot of legal, constitutional, governmental, etc. issues. And your job is going to be to recognize them and to explain your understanding of basically how they would be handled in our system of government as it currently is. So we'll go through these directions and maybe that'll be a little bit clearer. As it says there, for this exam, you'll have a short story. It's going to give you those constitutional legal issues related to subject matter you've studied this semester. By the way, this is cumulative, so it does go back to those chapters on civil rights, civil liberties, etc. All right. After reading the question, the exam is going to require you to write a detailed essay that identifies these constitutional issues and describes how they would be handled by a court in our governmental system. So stop there for a second. One thing I will make note of is that you may not have anything that comes up as an issue that specifically will take you to that chapter on our judicial system. But keep in mind that even with that, some of the things that you've done will be tested, even though they are not necessarily the issues. So you, number one, want to go through and make sure you're familiar with our court system at the federal level so that you can know kind of how they would at least start to take an approach to this. Now, many of the decisions are actually going to be listed throughout the book. They're not just in the chapter on the courts. So if you have a free speech issue, for example, and we have some cases from the Supreme Court that your book cited, those will be back over in the chapter on your civil liberties, not in the one on the court system. So just make sure you understand that, but you do want to thoroughly understand how the courts operate, but you also want to make sure that you don't skip out on the things that that the court has rendered that are relevant and may be listed in other parts of the textbook. So you want to be pretty thorough in the way you study this. All right. All right. Picking up from there. Note, I will not grade your exam based on the conclusions that you reach per se. Right. However, and you see this is in bold, so it's important. Your opinion must remain consistent with the current statutes, case law, and other relevant materials from your class discussion, your textbook readings, and additional reading materials. You may remember that I said before the midterm that a lot of those readings that you did for discussions were going to be important for the final exam and not necessarily something that you would use for the midterm exam question. So when you get to those ones that involve civil liberties, there's a good chance this is where you want to use them. To score high in the rubric for the various categories, you need to show me that you have an understanding of everything we've done. So that means you do want to get those cases that you read for discussion weaved into your answer so that you show me that you're relating that to the textbook material and that you have a complete understanding of whatever it is that you're trying to point. Now, if you, again, I don't necessarily grade you the conclusions that you reach in the sense that you, if you write something like, you know, the Supreme Court's interpretation of free speech is this. If you put a caveat to that, my opinion is something that's completely different. That's fine. I mean, I don't want to say I don't care about your opinion, but what I want to say is in terms of grading, I don't care about your opinion. I'm not determining your grade based on what you think is right or wrong in terms of consistency with our Constitution. But this is also going to be something where you have to understand that regardless of what you like in terms of how the Constitution is interpreted, and this is true for you, this is true for every person in this country, I am sure, including myself, there are plenty of decisions that the courts have reached that I disagree with. That just simply does not change the fact, though, that that is the status of the law at this point in time. So if you say that affirmative action is unconstitutional, if you express that as an opinion, that is okay. All right. But if you say affirmative action is unconstitutional and you're expressing that as if that is the state of the law, that is not okay because that is wrong. That is not what the courts have said. So you can disagree with the courts, but make sure you tell us how the courts would decide so that I know that you know what would actually happen. I mean, just because I think something is unconstitutional or is constitutional does not mean the court's going to agree with me. And believe me, when it comes to the law, my opinion doesn't count. What counts is what the interpretation the courts have applied to it is. All right. Okay. Note that I have provided you here with some advice on citations. You do not need to provide full citations. You do not need to do APSA or any other. If you have done APA, MLA, you do not have to do any kind of full citation. What I need from you is that I know the source. So if you do something and you cite the case from Griffin, right, that we read for one of those discussions, you can put the name of the course, case. You don't have to put like all the other additional information like the year, the volume and page number of the index and all that stuff where I can find it. You can just put the case name. And if you just say the Griffin case, I will know what you mean, and that's what I'm looking for this one, that you are telling me where you're getting this from and that you're weaving it in there. So you do not have to be that precise. This is open book and open notes, so you can do that. I wouldn't suggest doing the full citation, but get the full case name in there because you have that available to you while you're writing. You can just get it there and put it in there. All right. Okay, I'm going to switch screens here a little bit, scroll down. This last one also is in bold that you see right there. I have provided one law. It is fictional. All right. This one fictional law is provided, and then all the case law statutes, any other laws that are described in the text or in the readings remain in effect. So, use this law as your basis that I made up. But all the real laws are what you really want to talk about. And that means statutes, statutory law, that means case law, that means anything that we have in the course. You can, if you dig down into it, actually go a little bit more philosophical perhaps and weigh in on some of the philosophical underpinnings of our rights. That's okay. Right? But it's really the case law and the statutes. And keep in mind, we've got some of those from our discussions. Do not forget that there is also a plethora of cases and some statutes that are listed and discussed in the chapters in the textbook, and you want to include those as well. Right. All right. This was brought up, and if you have been following politics for the last 20 years, you know that immigration has been a major issue that entire time. It has moved to the forefront in recent years, right? And it's maybe not the biggest issue right now, but it's still going to be up there as one of the more important ones. This was based off of some of the things, and they are, again, this is based on some stuff that was going on in our government, primarily under the Obama and the Trump administrations. It is not exactly like the policies that anybody put in place, Congress or either of those presidents, based it off of that, but put some nuances in there so you can, again, not just go look up the current case law on immigration policies and get answers on that. This is stuff that's going to have a little bit of difference in it, which may make a completely different outcome as to how a court would handle it. All right, but basically this is the way it reads. In 2020, the U.S. Congress passes a law that is aimed at improving a fair process to accept a reasonable number of refugees seeking asylum in the United States. Right? And then while ensuring that terrorist, criminal elements and other undesirables are not admitted. Right? This act is named the Refugee Inclusion Plan, commonly called the RIP, and these are the sections. This is much shorter than any actual law would be, but we just need a few things to kind of work from. The reason we have this law, by the way, is partly because you're still going to have some issues coming up under your civil rights, civil liberties, but this actually is going to also let you look at some of the materials in the chapters that we've done recently on Congress and the president. The bureaucracy is in that with the president as well, and give you some idea of some approaches to take to interpreting the story that comes up. All right. Section 1, the president will set policies to allow people determined to be refugees to gain admission to the U.S. Congress grants him the authority to determine the number of admittees based on global concerns. And then here's a caveat, provided that the number allowed to enter the country equals at least 5% of the total number of displaced individuals in all regions of conflict. All right. Section 2. The president shall establish a process to screen all RIP applicants, provided that the process protects the individual rights of the applicants to the same level afforded all United States citizens. Applicants shall be housed in U.S. government facilities until processing is complete. I'm going to stop there because there's something important to note here. Right? Every semester, some people will look at the potential violations of people's rights that are in the story. And they will go and do an answer that is basically kind of like they think they've got an easy cheat. Well, this person is not a citizen, and therefore they don't gain the same measure of protections that a U.S. citizen would have when it pertains to, say, free speech, free press, et cetera, et cetera. And to an extent, that is true. Until a person actually becomes a citizen of the country, whether they are here legally or not, immigrants, for example, do not necessarily get all of the protections under the Bill of Rights and other parts of the Constitution that a citizen would get. This is very dangerous territory, and don't touch it. The purpose of this is so that you can't do that. So if you say that the question decided because this person is not a citizen and therefore don't have the full protection of their rights that a citizen would have, that actually marks against you and you score low, because that is basically that's a reading comprehension level right there. This tells you, and that's why I put this language in there, provided that the process protects the individual rights of the applicants to the same level afforded all United States citizens. In other words, you don't have the option of saying they don't get the full protection of rights because they're not citizens, because this law says they have to get that protection regardless. Right? By the way, that is put there for a number of reasons. One is because some of our rights, everybody gets to the same level. Some of the rights are more closely tied to citizenship, and we haven't gone through enough to discuss which ones are which. And, you know, for example, if you say free speech, people don't get that right because they're not citizens to the same level. That would actually be wrong anyway, because they do. It's going to be usually those legal system process rights that might not get the same protections as citizenships. This is so that you don't have to worry about that, but it's also so that you have to look at this and just do an analysis of those rights. Right. Okay, section 3. Again, notice the language and be precise with the language here. Any applicant with ties to terrorist or criminal organizations or with a criminal conviction equivalent to a felony under U.S. law shall be denied entry and deported within 10 days. That's all there is to that law. Right. The rest of this, as you can see, it goes on for roughly about a page, right, is basically just a story. So here we go. We're going to kind of highlight some of the issues here. It's going to be your job to go in and fill out the details. All right, to conform to the guidelines in RIP, the president institutes a cap of 100,000 refugees who may gain entry under the law. Right. He also decides to house applicants in the barracks on several military bases that have recently closed, but installs bars on all windows and doors. He also decides to use facial recognition technology to establish identities and uses stored rations to feed the applicants. All right. So basically, you want to go back and look and see if you go back to section 1, this looks like it does, in fact, fit quite well with what we've got. And you want to talk about, again, the chapter on Congress and to some extent the chapter on the president and the bureaucracy. They talk about delegation of lawmaking ability to the executive, right? Oftentimes in rules and regulations, but basically you want to make a note that this does look legal because Congress does have the power to delegate rulemaking authority to the executive, either to the president or to the agencies within his control under the bureaucracy, right? The tendency here is many students will go into some discussion about how putting bars on the windows and so forth, creating, what seems like a prison atmosphere, may violate some rights there, right? You can have that discussion, but I don't know that you have any evidence from the textbook or anything else that would actually support that contention. And you don't, I mean, I guess you can do external research, but you don't have to. I would just avoid it because you don't need to talk about it in order to score even an A on this. All right. All right, going on from there, the president enacts several other provisions through executive orders to maintain order and create a manageable processes, right? And then we note here, as refugees begin entering the camps, the president allows volunteers to clean and set up the barracks to cut costs. In exchange, several nonprofits are allowed to place religious works in the living quarters. Muhsin Muhammad enters his living quarters and finds a copy of the Quran near his assigned bed. Mr. Muhammad takes offense and sues the federal government, saying that a Christian refugee who fled his home due to Islamic terrorist activities, that as a Christian refugee who fled his home due to Islamic terrorist activities, this violates his civil rights. All right. This one should be kind of obvious what the issue is, but people do get this confused just about every semester that I've used this one. The issue is not religious freedom. Say that again, it is not about this person's rights to their religious freedom, right? This is about separation of church and state. So many people will come down on the side that that's fine to put the Quran there because he still has the right to practice his religion. It doesn't really interfere with that. That doesn't matter one bit. This is a discussion on separation of church and state, whether the president and the government is showing some support to that religion and its organizations. So go down that track in your textbook, not the one as to whether this violates the individual's freedom of religion. Right. This goes into the second page of the document. This is a Ms. Amanda Bonner also complains about the procedural policies when she is required to remove her hijab to have her face scanned through facial recognition software. All women had been processed by women guards, and Ms. Bonner recently converted to Hinduism, but believes that the religious requirements of humility still require her to cover her face. No branch of Hinduism currently has a requirement that women do that they cover their faces. Right. By the way, I don't know if that is actually true or not because I don't even know all the different branches of Hinduism. I put that in there so that that is one of the things that you weigh in your decision as to how the courts would react to this. And this one, again, also relates to religion. And this is, again, put in there because this one does test the other side of this. This goes not to whether the government is separating from religion. This does go specifically to this Miss Bonner's freedom to practice her religion, right? Or in other words, if you want to use the technical terms, if you remember them, when you get that previous paragraph, you want to look at the what's called the separation clause, right? Separation of church and state is discussed in it. And this one is the free exercise clause, the right to free exercise of religion, right? You will find some cases in the chapter on that do discuss the extent to which a person can practice their religion free from government influence, and when there are some certain lines drawn that separate when a person's free exercise comes to the point where it's preventing the government from doing its job, right? One of the classic cases, of course, would be Mormons in the 1800s sued under their free exercise when Utah became a state and banned polygamy, and they drew a distinction between religious belief and religious practice. Right? Incidentally, I'll give you a hand, and again, this is to the people who pay attention to the video recordings. The fact that no branch of Hinduism currently has that requirement is completely irrelevant. It matters not one bit if it's one person or 1 billion people who have that belief. That belief is personal. It is, and the right belongs to that person as an individual. That right does not belong to the Roman Catholic Church, for example. So it doesn't matter if you have a Christian belief or a Hindu belief or any belief that differs from the formal organizations, if you believe it, that's all that matters, because again, it is your right, not the church's right, not the mosque's right, not any religious group's right. So that is actually there to throw people off to see if they fall for that trap, right? And so I just gave you a freebie there. And again, that's because I know some people actually don't even watch the recording. So I'll be using that to check on who actually was and was not. All right. Miss Bonner's husband, Adam, is found to have a record for arrest in Karachi, Pakistan for speeding 5 miles an hour over the speed limit. A search is ordered, and in the process, 3 pounds of heroin is discovered in the quarters to which immigration has assigned to him and his wife. He is arrested and booked for possession of narcotics. During the booking, it's discovered that Adam is actually a woman, and same-sex marriages are not allowed under the laws of Pakistan. And Pakistan revokes the marriage license when the case comes to their attention. As several hearings are conducted, it becomes apparent that the heroin belongs to Amanda. Adam had no knowledge of the drug, and both are deported. Now, this one seems like it's got a lot in there. It does. There's quite a few things. Some of these things I want to just, you may not even have some case law on specifically, so I want to see if you can just reason through it and use your own sense of logic to come to a good conclusion, right? In this case, right, one thing is kind of obvious. He's arrested for speeding 5 miles over the speed limit. If you look, the search is ordered. And remember, this person has these same rights as a citizen does. Right? Does that person have a right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures, or even reasonable searches and seizures, when a warrant has not been issued? Notice there is no mention of any warrants. So the first thing you got to look at is, does the government need a warrant to search their housing, right? You might also, and there's going to be, and of course, the government owns the housing, so that raises some other issues. And you'll look for a key phrase: does that person have an expectation of privacy? Even though the government owns it, does not necessarily mean that they get to come in there and search to get the individual stuff. Right? Right. When they find this stuff, notice also if a warrant was ordered. Even if a warrant was not needed and you could say it was based on probable cause. Do you have that? Not really, because again, your speeding over 5 miles an hour is not a felony, which is what it states up there. You can go through these processes when a person has committed the equivalent of a felony under U.S. law. So this is, let's say this is a felony in Pakistan, it does not matter. It doesn't say that they have to have been convicted of a felony. But if 5 miles an hour is a felony in Pakistan, but since it's not in the United States, that does not meet that criteria of, I believe that was Section 3, right? Now, this is also some stuff for you to just reason through. He's arrested, but then they find out he's a woman, and biologically, I guess, and the same-sex marriages are not allowed under the laws of Pakistan. This is actually not necessarily a transgender issue, by the way. This could be someone who just in a same-sex marriage or relationship in Pakistan disguised themselves as a woman. So it's not necessarily transgender involved in this at all. It could be, but it doesn't have to be. But we know same-sex marriages are not allowed under the laws of Pakistan, and they revoke the marriage license. That doesn't seem, what does that have to do with? Well, again, reason through. Now, typically, if you've got a married couple, they own property jointly. So if they would have a reason to support, if they had a reason to search Adam in his property, if that was considered joint property, then they could search the living arrangements. If, on the other hand, though, now they are not married, right, then if they search Adam's stuff, they might have cause. If they search Amanda's stuff, then maybe they don't, right? So there's some things to look up there under warrants and warrantless searches. And then if you can't find anything, there's some stuff in there for you to just use your brain and think of the logical response to it. And I don't care which way you come on that if there's no case law on it. Again, that's the process I'm looking for, that you follow some logical steps to come to that conclusion, not that you actually come to a specific conclusion if we don't have a true answer. All right, notice that both are deported. You want to look at something in our civil liberties and bone up on the stuff that goes over due process. All right, due process basically means a lot of things. All right, but the note basically it means that the process that you go is fair, impartial. All right. If it's found out that the heron belongs to Amanda, right, Adam doesn't even know about it, how does he get deported too? Right, what has he done? So there is a due process issue with that. Right, there may still be some due process issues with Amanda. Weighing in on, again, mostly related back to the legitimacy of the search in the first place, but also did she get a chance to defend herself, the appeals and all that stuff. Read up on due process and sculpt that answer to conform to what you find in the textbook there. Right. There we go. As the quarters become overcrowded, living conditions become more difficult to maintain. Using her phone to access the internet, Hildy Johnson, an Israeli expatriate, what expat is short for, who lived in Nigeria and fled terrorist attacks aimed at Jews, starts a blog that describes the living conditions, overcrowding, abusive behavior towards the guards, and religious tensions between the various groups who are housed together. Several brawls break out between the Sikh and Jewish inhabitants due to Ms. Johnson's claims of preferred treatment for Sikhs housed in the quarters. Right. Some issues here. The first one is, note that she starts a blog. What actual part of the First Amendment might protect her speech here? Speech, verbal speech, governed under our freedom of speech provisions, right? And most other forms of expression are protected there in well, if you may remember, for example, flag burning, you're not saying words per se, but if you burn a flag, that's a protected expression, form of expression, right? We also have provisions governing freedom of press. So you look at the blog and decide which one that belongs to. We have a case that we read that governs who is actually governed and protected by freedom of the press, that goes into whether a regular person or a professional journalist gets those protections. So review that as well as the stuff in the chapter. All right, due to these brawls, the president ordered a shutdown of all wireless access in the barracks. And apparently I messed that one up, hoping to end the brawls, I would presume. All right, Neville Brand, fleeing IRA terrorism in Ireland, begins giving speeches saying that no one can use Snapchat because of the Jew. He gains popularity with several of the people and begins giving speeches denying the Holocaust. Guards promptly confine him to his quarters to prevent his speeches from causing a riot. So you're going to want to go, first of all, if you look at that, you might say that this was hate speech. So you want to go again back into the chapters on freedom of speech and see if there are any exceptions to hate speech, right? And how that can be dealt with. You can see if he can be put into his quarters and confined there, whether that violates his First Amendment rights or not. But the first part is actually what I want you to focus on. You don't have an actual answer to this. Again, many people just go through and say, well, the shutdown of the wireless is fine because the government owns it. They're paying for it. Right? And that might be a good answer. You might come to that conclusion, but you need to go into a deeper discussion of that. Remember, we had a case that examined whether or not the government could keep you from exercising your speech rights on government property. In that case, they said that there are certain things that are public fora, where traditionally that's been where people go to give speeches. So that you can't just say you can't go to the park and speak, because that's what people have always done. That's where protests start. That's where people get the right to go up there and say whatever they feel about the government. Same thing about the sidewalks. Now, your job is to take a look at this. Again, this case is on point to a certain extent, but you have to make a logical argument, not for whether or not they can just shut it off because they own it. What you're looking at is to whether or not the wireless, the internet, basically, internet access is something they can really shut off. Or is this like the sidewalk, where this is now the public forum where everybody goes to have their discussion, and once the government provides it, they can't keep you from going there and exercising those free speech, or maybe free uh, press rights. Okay. All right. But again, don't forget to look at the hate speech and whether or not that is protected or not. Come down to the next paragraph. Officials also begin a policy of housing all members of the same religion together and allowing access to common areas to only a single group at a time for exactly 1 hour a day. These areas include the cafeteria, showers, television, game room, gym, education facilities that are provided for children. All right, now, however, due to now let's deal with that part first, actually. Should be obvious. What you're looking at there is going to be the chapter on civil rights, and what you see is something on segregation. All right, now your textbook discusses segregation, which, as it was always applied, primarily focused on racial segregation. Now you're looking at segregation based on religious beliefs, so you're going to be looking at those rules and see if they should apply the same way. So you're going to have case law on there about segregation, but not segregation focused on religion. And again, this is where you apply your understanding. You show me that you've got this, but then you apply a logical thought process to come out with a conclusion of what you think the courts would do based on what the courts have said. But again, there's little differences. So you can argue that it doesn't come out the same way. You can argue it does come out the same way. It's up to you. And again, I don't care about your opinion. I care about the fact that you understand the segregation material in the textbook and other places, and that you can think it through and use a good process to get to your decision. All right. Let's see, about halfway through that paragraph, we'll pick back up there. However, due to historical limits on educational access to Islamic women, Islamic girls have 2 hours of instructional time. Also, due to a recent history of sexual assaults against women in India and Germany, women from those countries are assigned hand-to-hand combat training during their gym times. What you have here is not exactly the segregation per se. This is something that's going to be more in line with affirmative action. Again, most of the affirmative action that you see is based on race, although you may find some affirmative action materials based on gender. This is still going to be different because this is not, strictly speaking, just based on gender. That is a major element of it. But you also have this affirmative action based on two things at the same time. In one case, Islamic girls, it's gender and religion, right? And then you have India and Germany, doesn't mention religion, so you have gender and nationality as the reasons for this affirmative action. So look at those and review the materials on affirmative action as you go into your discussion on this part of it. Another thing that you can look at is, with the women being assigned hand-to-hand combat, you also may have some issues on some due process violations and so forth, based on the fact that these women apparently don't get the choice in that. So everybody else gets to go to the gym and I guess have free gym time as far as we know. These women don't get to go and just do what they want. They have to go in for the hand-to-hand combat training. So that could also be something that you raise, right? All right, the very end of it, upon reaching 4.9% of the world's refugee population, the president claims that the efforts to house and process refugee claims have exceeded the budget provided by Congress and the program will no longer take any new applicants. So we have a few things here. We basically, you at the beginning can't really argue that Congress doesn't have the power to delegate authority to make rules to the president, because that's been an accepted practice for the entirety of our existence under that Constitution. But what we do have here is going to be the separation of powers issue that you might have thought that was raised. Congress is mandating 5%. President is stopping at 4.9%. President doesn't have any money to do anything else. And Congress was the one that's supposed to give the president that money. How do you handle that? There is not something that is directly dealing with this kind of scenario per se in your textbook, but you do have some materials as you read through the chapters on the Congress and the president that will give you some insight on how to approach it. So that's what you're looking to do. Right? Again, I'm not looking at how you come down on it. What I'm looking for is how you get to the decision that you do come to. All right. All right, that's basically it for the exam itself. I'm going to take a quick look back over on the rubric, and I'm going to switch back over to that screen where we were downloading that file. I'm just going to go back one step, right, and look at our final exam. When you come up, you can see the wording, by the way, is pretty much exactly the same. All right. And when I come over, to the test options, you're basically going to have unlimited time to do this. You do have to turn it in by 12/6, but you could start writing now and take this entire time until then to finish writing it up. All right. The suggestion I would give, just like I did for the midterm, is that you write it up in Microsoft Word or something of that nature, whatever you use as your word processor, and then you submit the entirety of it by copying and pasting it into the text box and just hitting submit. And I would, again, just like before, suggest that you go ahead and email me the the file itself, just in case something happens with Blackboard. All right. Now, this is our rubric. I'm going to pop that up. You won't be able to actually access it, so I'm going to refer you to this video. Right. I'll see if I can do a print job and post that for you as well. Basically, you can see we got 30, 30, 30, and then 10%. Right. Use of facts is 30%. Right. And this is going to be that you're using those things from the textbook and also all the other things that we've done in the course. If you are just putting your opinions in there, like off the top of your head, notice that puts you in the F range. Right? If you're putting some stuff in, that you get from the textbook, some ideas that you get from the textbook, basically, that's going to put you in the D range. Right? For the C range, you need to actually start saying, such and such constitutional provision. This is more than saying the First Amendment in those first two issues, for example, being able to specify this is specifically the separation clause and this other one is specifically the establishment clause. Right? Once you get to the B's, you should be showing that you know everything, that not everything, but that you've gone through the textbook and all the case law or statutes that they cite on something. There's a lot of, Civil Rights Act, for example, is cited and discussed a lot on those affirmative action and segregation issues. Right? We have cases from the textbook on free speech issues, free press issues, and then of course we also have ones that were put in for our discussions. Make sure you bring those in too when they are relevant. Keep in mind, I picked those specifically to go with this final exam. So you definitely want to make sure that the ones that are really relevant to this discussion, you include some discussion of those here. Now, um, basically the difference between the A and the B is just a matter of how much. So you put you're putting some of the case law, the statutes, et cetera, in the B range, and you're putting just about all of it up there in the A range, right? And again, that's really going to be just a matter of degree. So, but to get to the A and B range, you want to start talking about cases, statutes. Um, you might have some political thinkers that they're citing there as well, the Constitution itself, so on and so forth, right? Next is that you're actually applying those government provisions, those principles, right? And again, if you're off topic or you misinterpret them completely or something like that, you're in the F range. If you got at least one of those, you're in the D range. C range, this is where you're identifying what this is. So again, federalism, separation of powers. Separation of powers, for example, would be that last one. You know, president stops tape win when it reaches 4.9%. And then you go a little bit farther beyond that for the A and B. You start explaining how each one applies specifically to the question, right? So that we understand, and that's where you get into those. I would say go back to that chapter on the Constitution, and perhaps that federalism really isn't much at issue here, so I think you could avoid that, but go to the chapter on the Constitution and get into the underlying principles behind the Constitution and discuss them there, not just, oh, it's separation of, you know, between the Congress and the president, separation of powers. You want to go in and look at, you know, why, and those are there, and how the courts typically deal with a separation of powers issue, even if we don't have a case on it, but in general, right? Then the third part there is 30% is your logical process. And again, you just don't provide any process. You just, this is unconstitutional and move on, or this is constitutional and move on. That's your F range. A lot of people, again, argue on emotional beliefs. So again, like I said, if you say this is unconstitutional because there's no way affirmative action is acceptable under the Constitution of the United States, you're in the F range, because you might feel that way. You might 100%, you know, feel that way, and maybe 90% of the country agrees with you at this point in time. But the reality is, when you go in and you read the chapter, that is not what the courts say. And we have to live under the law as it is. You can't go kill somebody and shoot somebody and say, I don't believe in the law of murder, and expect that they're not going to throw you in prison. Similarly, you can't just say that there is no way that affirmative action is constitutional when the courts have ruled that it is. They put severe limitations on it. So our opposite is true as well. You can't say, well, this is obviously discrimination that they're trying to overcome, and affirmative action should always be used. That's not a good answer either. That's also emotional and lacks a foundation. You have to look at the cases and see exactly what is and is not allowable under the state of our law right now, not what you want it to be. Flawed logic, basically you read the cases and you may misinterpret them. You're likely to end up in that D range. You got some factual information, like you're mentioning maybe some of the case names and so on. That's going to get you in the C range. And then, of course, 80 to 90, 90 to 100, those, it's the degree between those you're going to go into. All the stuff that we have used, the stuff in the textbook. If we have cases, like we don't have a case on affirmative action, but we did have a case on what was usable, all right, and it was aimed at gender discrimination, obviously. You may remember the case, the Rawlinson case. That is something that's beyond the textbook. You do not have to go out and, you know, research web pages, and I would actually prefer that you don't do that. That doesn't show me that you know the stuff from the course. That shows me that you got research skills. I need to know that you know the stuff that you're supposed to know, having been in the course for the semester. So don't do the research. That makes more work for you, or should make more work for you. If you know the material, use it, and you will get that A if you do the steps that are required here with what you have available to you, right? In fact, it can hurt you because if people go out and rely on other information, it may be wrong, right? It may be outdated. It may also be that if you use that information, that you actually end up, again, getting points deducted because what happens is some people haven't studied much. They figure it's actually easier to go just find someone who's organized it already, do some research, and then they put a lot of stuff that is great. I mean, it's right on point and so forth. But the problem is it does not show me that you know the stuff from the textbook. And I'm looking for that. So if you go and do research and rely on that 100%, then you are not getting the stuff you need in there because I need to see that you know the textbook, the additional readings, all of that material. We had a research paper. That's what I use to see if you know how to do research papers. So don't do that for this. Right? It makes too much work and you assume too much risk with it. Right? Some people did that on the midterm, by the way. They did it outside of research, and that outside of research led them to incorrect conclusions, and it hurt their grade rather than helped it. And again, I don't need to see additional stuff. I need to see that you know the stuff that you're, basically supposed to know, that you're responsible for knowing. The last part is basically just errors, mechanics and organization. Again, I'm not really a big on that for the final exam. Usually when it gets to the point where it makes it very difficult for me to understand the points that you are trying to get across, then that's when this comes into play. But for the most part, honestly, if you've got 1 or 2 errors in there and they're very minor, like you missed a comma, and it does not change the context of the statement, I might not even notice it. If you get to the point where every third word is misspelled and I just, normally spend 5 minutes on this thing and it's taking me like 30 minutes just because I have to reconstruct the sentences, that's when this really becomes an issue. But basically that is it. So I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to post this up for you very soon. In fact, right after this session is recorded. So by the time you watch this, it takes time to process. So I will have it posted up before you actually get to view this. So you can go and I will post that in your final exam folder right there with the study guide and the exam. So you can go find that rubric right there. Right. And that basically brings this discussion to a conclusion. As usual, any questions, feel free to call or more realistically, email me. If you have trouble with the email, I've had a few people who've emailed, mostly advisees, not students in my classes, but if you don't get a response by the next day, email again or call, because if I don't respond by the next day, that more than likely means that for some reason your email did not go through and you want an answer, particularly if you are working on your final exam. Remember, this is going to be about 20% of your overall grade. That is actually going to be not about, it's going to be 20% of your overall grade. And you want to do as well as possible. It's going to really be able to move the dial on your grade. So with that, I'm going to cut off, but do not hesitate if you have questions to reach out to me. If you don't understand what you're looking for, what I'm looking for, then please reach out to me so that I can try to get you some help before it's too late and this thing gets down to the last day or two and you have to submit it. All right. With that, y'all have a good weekend, and I will see y'all pretty soon here.